Located on the Baltic Sea between Finland and Sweden, sit the Åland Islands. Despite being part of Finland legally, the Åland Islands remain culturally Swedish, while enjoying the largest amount of autonomy from the central government in Helsinki. Additionally, the islands remain demilitarized under supervision from the Russian consulate of Mariehamn despite their strategic location, which with the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine might seem like a bad idea, especially as Finland is not yet an official member of NATO. Why are these islands demilitarized? And why are they part of Finland despite being Swedish in culture? Why are these islands the site of what is, in my opinion, the perfect compromise? These are the questions that I seek to answer today. The Åland Islands are a set of islands in the archipelago sea off the southwestern coast of Finland. Located between Sweden and Finland, they are geographically a continuation of Finland through the Finnish archipelagos, while a more clear strait of water separates them from Sweden despite their closer proximity to it. It acts as the central choke point between the northern Gulf of Bothnia and the rest of the southern Baltic Sea. It was thanks to this close proximity of the Åland Islands to Sweden that Swedes would begin to migrate to them, until the islands became officially a part of Sweden during the 12th century. Through the Åland Islands, the Christian Swedish kingdom would wage northern crusades to Christianize the pagan Finnish lands to their east during the 12th and 13th centuries, while Swedish settlement of the western Finnish coast had been occurring for a longer time. During the many wars of the militaristic Swedish Empire, the Åland Islands acted as an important stopping point for Swedish naval vessels on their way to Finland. Simultaneously, they acted as a bridge that would allow the Russians to threaten the Swedish capital of Stockholm in 1809 during the Finnish War. After the Swedish defeat in the Finnish War, it was forced to cede Finland and Åland to Russia, after which Finland would be made into an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire in order to quickly pacify the conquered territory. During the Crimean War, the Åland Islands experienced the war firsthand as the combined Franco-British force of warships and marines occupied the islands and destroyed the Russian fortress of Bomersund. In the peace treaty which ended the Crimean War in 1856, one of the requirements for peace was the demilitarization of the Åland Islands. The First World War would see the islands become the site of the naval battle of the Åland Islands, where Russian and German fleets clashed with each other in 1915. After Russia's collapse into civil war in 1917, the autonomous Grand Duchy of Finland declared independence, and with this, the status of the Åland Islands became an area of conflict between Sweden and the newly independent nation of Finland. After Finland gained independence in 1917, the people of the Åland Islands worked towards getting incorporated into Sweden, for which they would hold a referendum regarding the matter of being annexed into Sweden in 1919. The referendum saw over 95% of the islanders vote in favor of annexation, but the Finnish government would only accept to give the islands autonomy instead. During the Finnish Civil War of 1918, the islands would be occupied by a Swedish peacekeeping force, before they gave way to the Germans who had been invited by the conservative white government of Finland to occupy the islands. After the German surrender to the Entente powers and the end of the Finnish Civil War in favor of the whites, the Finnish government would reinstate control over the islands and would only accept giving them autonomy, despite the clear desire of the local population to join Sweden. In 1921, the dispute over the status of the Åland Islands was handed over to the newly formed League of Nations, which would rule in favor of Finland. This meant that the islands would remain a part of Finland, but as an autonomous region which was to additionally remain demilitarized. The demilitarized status of the islands would be respected during the Second World War, with the island's merchant shipping being largely spared by the combatants of the war. From the end of the Second World War to today, the Åland Islands have enjoyed an unprecedented amount of autonomy as a part of Finland, with the other Swedish-speaking regions of the country never experiencing the same kinds of privileges. However, as tensions on the Baltic heat up, with the Finnish entry into NATO being a question of time, it remains to be seen whether the status of the Åland Islands will need to be revisited in the face of the rapidly changing geopolitical landscape of the Baltic Sea. So, what makes the Åland Islands and their status extraordinary? Why am I asking the question of why these islands are a part of Finland in the first place? When the Åland Islands became an autonomous region of Finland in 1922 following its regional assembly's first meeting, it was a truly unique and an almost never before seen case of a nation granting one of its directly controlled territories such an extensive amount of political autonomy. While Great Britain had granted great amounts of political autonomy to its colonies turned dominions, like for example Canada, they were importantly colonies, and not exactly an integral part of Great Britain, like Åland was for Finland. Similarly, the Soviet Union around the same time saw itself organized under a union of Soviet Socialist republics, but the Russian Republic dominated the rest of the republics more as colonies. There were other governments with a more decentralized system of government, like the federal United States and the diverse but unitary system of Czechoslovakia. However, none of them had a minority population granted special rights like the Swedish-speaking population was given in the Finnish Åland Islands. Especially notable about Finland is how the white government, which had won the Finnish Civil War of 1918, was a conservative one, and prior to independence, there had been a conflict between the Swedish and Finnish-speaking population in Finland over language rights. The Finnish parliament would in 1920 pass a law to grant the Åland Islands autonomy, which the islanders seeking to join Sweden didn't accept. This was followed in 1921 by the decision of the League of Nations that the islands belonged to Finland as an autonomous region. The autonomous special status of the Åland Islands in practice means that the islands are a part of Finland, but most of its legislation is dealt with by its own political institutions. Its legislature, known as the Provincial Days, consists of 30 members elected every 4 years. It appoints the provincial government of Åland in addition to dealing with the civil governance of the islands. Meanwhile, Finnish law is applied to foreign policy, the judiciary, tolls, and state taxation. The Åland Islands additionally have the Åland home region right, which is acquired by a person whose either parent has the right, while a person who has moved to Åland can apply for the right if they have lived on the islands for 5 years. This right is needed for a person to take part in Åland's local politics and economic life. The Åland Islands also enjoy Swedish being the primary and only official language, while all communication with the Finnish government is conducted in Swedish. A stark contrast with the rest of Finland, where Finnish and Swedish are the official languages, while English is also a mandatory school subject on top of the 2 official languages. While in Åland a vast majority of the population speaks Swedish, in the rest of Finland the Swedish speakers are concentrated on the western and southern coasts. Also, as an effect of the demilitarization of the islands, The people living there are not subject to the mandatory military service for men that the rest of Finland is subject to. The demilitarization of the islands also means that the islands cannot be fortified and that their neutrality is to be respected during wartime. The Åland Islands experience a truly special status in Finland, with special language rights, their own parliament, and no military service for men. While some might think that these privileges are unfair to the rest of Finland, I believe that the special status of the Åland Islands was the perfect compromise when it was first created. To understand why I believe that the Åland Islands received the perfect compromise, we need to look closer at the conflict of interests over the islands between Sweden and Finland. After Finland gained independence in 1917, the Åland Islands became a point of conflict between Sweden and Finland for two reasons: cultural and political. Towards the end of the First World War, and especially afterwards, the ideas of nationalism and a rule-based world order became prominent ideas in global politics. Sweden saw that the islands rightfully belonged to them because its people were culturally Swedish and they displayed a clear desire to join Sweden. Sweden's claim to the islands was based on nationalism, which means the idea of people of the same ethnicity or culture having the right to their own country. As such, Sweden saw that the Swedish people of the islands had the right to be part of Sweden based on their culture. Finland's claim to the islands was, on the other hand, based on the legality of ownership, because the Åland Islands had been legally part of the Grand Duchy of Finland ever since the Finnish War. Based on this, Finland claimed legal ownership over the islands. Geography was another important aspect which caused conflict over the Åland Islands, but it also was used as a bargaining chip. As already mentioned earlier in the video, the Åland Islands have historically acted as a bridge between Sweden and Finland, with the Russians using the islands to threaten the Swedish capital during the Finnish War. If Sweden were to control the islands, they would have the ability to disrupt naval traffic going to and from Turku, if relations between Sweden and Finland were to become worse in the future. Finland would use geography to justify their claim in the League of Nations, with Finland's envoy to Japan pointing out to the Japanese delegation that the Åland Islands are in fact a continuous archipelago that joins it with Finland, and furthermore, that deep-sea waters separate them from Sweden. This helped convince the Japanese delegation of the Finnish cause, as such a geographic precedent would further Japan's own goal of controlling the Pacific Islands. The final decision of the League of Nations was that the Åland Islands would be owned by Finland, while in turn they would be demilitarized and that the islands would be granted political and cultural autonomy. Now, here is why I believe that this was the perfect compromise. Firstly, the Swedish claim based on nationalism in regards to the island's culturally Swedish population was addressed with Finland being obliged to ensure the cultural autonomy of the islands, which would include Swedish being the island's only official language. The military aspect of the Åland Islands was addressed with the demilitarization of them, which meant that any direct security concerns in regards to the islands being owned by Finland would not be a problem to Sweden, as no military forces could be stationed on them. Lastly, the legality aspect used by Finland to claim the islands was addressed by the islands being granted to Finland. The success of this compromise can be best seen in a survey done by Åland Gallup in 2020, in which 78% of the respondents preferred the current autonomous status, with no great difference between demographics, while only 9% supported joining Sweden. Despite the cultural and language differences between the Åland Islands and the rest of Finland, a clear majority of the island's inhabitants prefer the status quo of remaining with Finland as an autonomous region. Even with the best decisions and compromises, there will always be problems because there is no such thing as a flawless decision. Even as the status of the Åland Islands has been for the most part a success story in political and cultural autonomy, and a territorial dispute being solved through diplomatic means, it still has its own downsides. The demilitarization of the islands, which ensured that no military power could threaten the Swedish capital from the east, also means that the islands are vulnerable to an invasion by a hostile power. Despite the fact that Finland is obliged to protect the islands in the case of their demilitarization being violated by a hostile power, the islands could be in theory seized by the numerically superior Russian Baltic Fleet, and Finland not yet being a NATO member would mean that the rest of Europe would be quite powerless to respond to the violation of territorial integrity due to Article 5 not applying to Finland yet. This was a theoretical possibility before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the president of the Donbas conflict in Ukraine and the Chinese seizure of the Spratly Islands were handled. However, with Finland's imminent entry into NATO and the decisive Western response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine have meant that this theoretical scenario has become practically impossible. While the Åland Islands inhabitants were incentivized to remain in Finland through no mandatory military service, political autonomy, and special language rights and protections as part of the compromise made in 1921, these have their own problems. The exemption from mandatory military service for the men of the Åland Islands is a core part of their demilitarization, but this also means that the residents of the islands are less prepared in the case of Finland being dragged into war. The lack of mandatory military service, in addition to the language rights, also means that the population of the islands and the rest of Finland have an additional cultural difference. Most notable, however, is the matter of language, as the residents of the Åland Islands primarily use Swedish, while the majority of the people in Finland use Finnish. In a survey done by the state-owned Finnish broadcasting company Yle in 2019, 26% of the people responded that they didn't know how to speak Swedish. When a quarter of the Finnish population doesn't know how to speak Swedish, and when the thought of Swedish being mandatory in high school matriculation exams is a controversial idea, one must ask if Swedish being the only mandatory language to learn in the Åland Islands is a good thing. As Finland is set to join NATO, the position of the Åland Islands in the Baltic Sea makes them a strategic asset for Finland despite their demilitarization. These historically Swedish islands, in terms of history, culture, and politics, were integrated through military force to Finland under Russia, so it could threaten the Swedish capital, only for the islands to become demilitarized following the Russian defeat in the Crimean War. After the breakup of the Russian Empire in 1917, the islands became a point of conflict between Sweden and Finland, as nationalism and the rule of law collided. The League of Nations compromise for the islands would go on to be an incredible diplomatic success story in resolving a territorial dispute between two countries, which would satisfy the needs of both the nations claiming the islands and the islanders themselves. Despite its success, the special status enjoyed by these Baltic islands are not without their problems. Can the demilitarization of the Åland Islands be maintained when Russia has shown its willingness to disregard international law? Can the special language rights of the islands be maintained when the Finnish population is split on the necessity of learning the Swedish language? These are questions which the Finns, under government in Helsinki, could be forced to answer as the world around them changes.